All right, so sabuta and welcome. My name is Renatarvos Takogenos. I am a Gallo-Roman polytheist and heathen, as well as a Tengrist practitioner and student, which is also known as Mongolian shamanism. Um, I also serve as a Watis here at Tuda Galastian. That means that I'm like a public service diviner. I'm also a member of Montellan Bolgon, the tradition of the Belgae, and I want to start by saying this presentation is given from the comfort of my living room at the feet of the Rockies. And this land is ancestral to the family of the Pueblo Native American peoples, which includes tribes such as the Navajo and the Hopi. It's also home ancestrally to other mountainous Native American tribes, such as the Ute tribe. These Great Plains to the west of me are also home the people that are grouped by Western academics as the Plains Native Americans, which is a largely artificial construction. But I do want to acknowledge that this space, which was shared by many in the past, is now claimed by only a few, most of whom are not part of any of the aforementioned Native groups. If you live in Canada, Mexico, the US, or South America, reach out to your local Native American groups and populations. Seek how you can be of assistance. We are all one people under the same sky, upon the same Mother Earth. Land back. All right, Kuno, you can give me the second slide, please. So today we will be looking at an old Gaulish creation myth using archaeology, historical accounts, mythology, and of course, a lot of speculation and theorizing. First, we're going to look at the imagery of the bull and the three-horned bull in Gaul and the rest of the ancient world. Then we'll discuss the concept and imagery of the world tree as it appears in different cultures and how it relates. Then at the end, I'll propose a version or a couple different versions of the Gaulish creation myth, as it may have been known at one point. My sources will be given at the end, but primarily we're leaning really heavily on our boy Julius Caesar from the Gallic Wars, as well as the Eddas, the Irish Book of Invasions, as well as the seminal and incredible work of Gerald Unterberger, who has sort of become an emerging voice in comparative mythology, dealing specifically with bull and bull imagery. His essays, Der Keltische Dreihornstier, which means the Celtic three-horned bull, as well as Der Indogermanische Wasserstier, which means the Proto-Indo-European water bull, are going to be foundational for a lot of this. So, with all that, welcome all. Don't have a cow. Sit back and relax. Grab a hot coffee or beverage of your choice. And let's jump right into the three-horned bull. Kuno, you can give me that next slide. What the Gauls originally pictured their gods to look like, no one can say for certain. We don't have anthropomorphic depictions of the gods. And in fact, just like the Germanoi, the concept seemed to be alien to them until Greek and later Roman influence. The earliest humanoid or human-resembling depictions of Gaulish deity come from Val Camonica, which were made by indigenous Alpine peoples who were Celtified over time. There's the famous Cernunnos carving, and also, of course, the lesser-known Tyrannos, and also a three-headed god, who unfortunately we failed to name, but the three-headed motif seems very common in Romano-British. Gallo-Roman is Gallo-Germanic artwork, so there may be a connection there. But anyway, before this, the Gauls did not depict their gods in anthropomorphic or human fashions. Latin-era art is dotted with knotworks, solar wheels, and most commonly animal motifs. There is, of course, the raven, the horse, and the dog, all of which are very much tied to later Gaulish deities. The raven as a symbol is common with many gods, including Gaulish Mercury, Sisonius, Cathabodua. The dog is tied to various matris and other figures such as Nehelenia, and of course the wine and underworld god Sukelos. The horse, of course, is tied to Epona, Borvo, and many other chariot riding gods, possibly Granus. But there is another animal that is depicted in Latvian art, whose godly counterpart is sadly not obvious. I'm speaking, of course, of the bull. The bull is common on Latvian era motifs, and it does seem to have persisted until later. Now, who exactly this deity is, we don't know, but we do know that later depictions are labeled by people working in the field, academics, as Tarvoi Trikunos, the bull with three horns. The bull also seems to exist as Tarvos Trigovaros, the bull with three cranes, which is actually the only attested name to this figure. The difference between the three cranes and three horns motifs will be addressed later, but just know during this presentation, I'll be using Tarvos Trigovaros to refer to this hypothetical bull deity and mythical figure since it is the attested name. A common conception is that the three-horned bull arose out of Gallo-Roman art, since most of the statues, as well as the Pillar of the Boatman, which is the famous example, seem to depict this deity, and they come out of Roman times, so of course, they must be Gallo-Roman. Now, we know that this is not entirely true. So we have three-horned bull imagery and two-horned bull imagery that lines up with the later three-horned bull imagery that comes out of Latian era. And while it was long thought that Tarvos arose out of this purely Gallo-Roman context, this view is, in thanks to such scholars as Unterberger and his contemporaries, no longer held as the default. In fact, we see the origin of this motif, that of the bull, is tied to Bronze Age Gaul and the wider Bronze Age culture. It is especially common in the Urnfield age. And we have here the evidence of the first known altars or representations of divinities within continental Celtic world. You're going to see those semicircular divines, often made of fired clay ceramics or molten metal cast into a shape. They're oftentimes called fire dogs because they bear a visual relationship to log holders used to hold firewood for fires inside chimneys, which are also called fire dogs. However, these figures are now more commonly referred to as moon ships. First of all, because there's never any evidence that they were used to hold logs of any kind, nor have we found them inside of any fire pits or fireplaces. And we rarely discover any matching sets. They seem to be individual things. These sky boats were common motifs on Gaulish coins as well, but also on various other artifacts. And we see, for example, a similar boat to this on the Nebra sky disk. Like a heavenly vessel upholding the cosmos. Keep this idea of a world-supporting vessel in mind because we're going to circle back to it later. Next slide, please, Kuno. Within Gaul, most of the images, all right, I just misclicked. Here we are, we're back. Within Gaul, most of the, there we go. We see numerous large, within Gaul, there we go. Most of the images of the bull in question come from Gallo-Roman time period as discussed, but we do see numerous large metallic sculptures dedicated to Tarvos, as well as many smaller votives. There is a large difference in material as well as skill of the artists that made these. Some are very rudimentary, some are highly detailed, like that picture you see there. It's going to have really, really swirly mane. It's going to be detailed down to the eyelids, and some other ones are just a lump of clay with a couple of horns jutting out of it. We have several carvings, votives, and coins depicting pictures resembling a bull or men wearing a three-horned head adornments. Now, while there's no explicit text or image tying together the three-horned bull and the three-horned man, I'll be making my case in a bit for why those two traditions are related. So let's go to some examples. Slide 5, please, Kuno. Awesome. So images common to the three-horned bull are, of course, a bull with a wavy mane who has two horns, one on either side of the head. Sometimes bulbed, but sometimes filed to a point. The pointed ones being the far more common depiction later on, with the bulbous ones being the more early depictions, especially when it comes to Latian era examples. And sometimes there is a third horn sprouting out from between those two. Now, sometimes instead of that third horn, there are actually three other horns, making it a five horns depiction. Sometimes it is just a little nub, sometimes it's a column, sometimes it's a tree, and in the Minoan example, famously, we see an axe. Now, whether these two and three horns or the three horns are the exact same image is something that we're going to talk about here in a little bit. But I'll be transparent and say that for now, I do believe, according to my own research, that we're looking at different variations of the same concept. It seems that the idea of a bull supporting the world or world pillars was common throughout the Bronze Age world. And whether it's an axe or a tree or a horn, these seem to be different cultural lenses. Um, Furthermore, another thing that is common that you're going to see in a lot of these, especially the example from Crete and the Etruscan example, and again, the Latien example, is that we have a stole or a band or a decoration running about the midsection of the bull. This artistic tradition goes all the way back to Minoa, where we do have the most famous examples. And Minoa and Mycenaean Greece, which we know had a heavy influence on Gaulish art, especially during the period oftentimes depicting the bull. And the sacrificial bulls specifically have this stole wrapped around them. And this interpretation by Unterberger is said to be a symbol of holiness or ritual sacrifice, bedecking the bull, denoting its sacred nature. So what we see here is a continuation of the theme. The two-horned bull and the three-horned bull seem to be evolutions of the same theme and not necessarily entirely different things. So what does the three-horned bull mean? Another thing that comes to us from Minoa is possibly the depiction of heroes with horned bronze helmets, which might be a precursor to the three-horned helmets of later Gaul. In fact, again, these bronze horned helmets seem to be common throughout all of the Bronze Age Europe. Even though it was very, very different cultures and peoples, this seems to have been a theme that was spread and adopted by many cultures. Next slide, please. Now, I'm not making the claim that the helmets reflect a fully formed cult or even a universal belief. I want to be clear about that. But instead, I think that they demonstrate that the idea of three horns or three horns in a pillar was already a common motif by the Bronze Age. The ancestors of the Gauls, the earlier continental Celts, would have already been familiar with this. We also see various statues of bulls with lobed horns, and this especially is very, very common in the hero art that we see during that time, like the example there in the bottom left corner. The connection between a bull cult and the helmet cult involving sometimes three horns may have already existed at that time, but I find it unlikely. Instead, I think the cult of the bull, which was already widespread, was probably originally a two-horned image until the introduction of the three-horned hero, a motif brought to Gaul from Minoa via Sardinia and then up through the Etruscans, which gave rise to several expressions of the three-horned bull. That of the bull with three horns and that of a bull with two horns and a world tree would be the most common ones within Gaul. The three horns would represent the three worlds being upheld by Tarvos, upon whose neck they rest. Or the three worlds may also be represented by the tree, which rests upon Tarvos's head, which is instead cradled by the other two horns, which form a sort of celestial boat or moonship, like those found on Gaulish coins or the Nebra sky disk. In many depictions, we also see holes running through the body of the bull in the same area that the stole is. And keep this in mind because we're going to see a great example of this on the pillar of the boatmen. This indicates that they may have been mounted upon a wooden pole, another symbol of the world column. And this is very similar to other early Roman age mystery cults, like the hand of Jupiter Optimus Maximus Stolicanus, or that of Sabazios. Next slide, please. So we've already talked a little bit about the three-horned bull, so let's talk about variations of the theme. The three-craned bull. The bull with three cranes, Tarvos Trigvados, from the pillar of the boatman. He also has a stole right in the middle. And actually, Kuna, if you could go back a slide. Yeah, one more. One more. Right there. So the pillar of the boatman, if you can see on that top image, Tarvos Trigvaros, he too has a stole lapping around him. And it also is shown by the tree that seems to either grow through him or pierce him, depending upon the reconstruction of the image. So there's variation in that. We're going to see a slightly different reconstruction of this later on. Yeah, so if you could go forward again, I just wanted to reference back to that. Oh, too far, there you go. So we're dealing now with the difference between Trikunos and Trigvaros. It's very commonly claimed that this could have been arisen if the pillar was commissioned by a diverse group of people, but carved by one singular individual who may or may not have been familiar with the tradition of the visual language employed by the Gauls. And as a result, it could have been a simple mistranslation from horns to cranes. I also think it could have just been a different use of the image. It could have been an evolution or a regional difference. Which came first? I'll probably lean more towards the three-horned. The matter also still stands that if we would take the bull from the pillar of the boatman and rotate him and look at him head on, we would see a same image as down there on the bottom right with that Gaulish coin. The bull with the horns and the tree out of the middle, which is again very similar to that more anthropomorphized later Roman depiction in the top right, where the figure has horns and a tree sprouting out of his head. So perhaps with the pillar of the boatman, it's just a matter of perspective. It would be, the three-horned imagery could be an older interpretation that evolved out of the more complex horn and tree depiction, but that one is later. So again, we're not entirely sure on this. There's not a lot of comparative things to go by, but I do think that a lot of these variations of themes show that the boatman pillar is simply just a different interpretation upon the same theme. Because of how everything lines up, it is still supporting the world column, and we still have the horns acting as a sky boat. And of course, the stole in the middle is still present. So we're going to be talking about mythic parallels and the mythology of the three horns, as well as the pillar of the boatman when we get to the mythology section. But first, let's dive a bit deeper into, now that we've discussed the three cranes and the three horns, we're going to talk a bit about the world tree. Next slide, please. So the tree of life. The tree of life is a common interpretation of an axis mundi, something that ties together all three worlds simultaneously. The tree oftentimes is a representation of the same three worlds. The most famous example is the tree of life, which comes to us from Norse mythology. There's Yggdrasil, the world tree that has its roots in the worlds below, its trunk in Midgard, the middle world, and of course its branches in the heavens, upon which sits perched a giant eagle. Remember the eagle. We're going to circle back to that. There is also a counterpart in Finnish mythology. This time the world tree isn't alone. The world tree is placed upon a world mountain, but nevertheless it serves the very same artistic function. The world tree and world mountain also exist within Vedic mythology, though later Hindu and Buddhist mythologies will change this exclusively to a world mountain, although the tree still maintains a very sacred place, especially the Bodhi tree, under which Buddha meditates to gain enlightenment, comes to mind. Within Vedic mythology, we do see that it is still occasionally represented as a tree. And then the fact that the tree and the mountain symbols are interchangeable or deeply related is also evidenced in the Mongolian tradition, especially in Buryat shamanism, where the world tree, which is also sometimes referred to as the world mountain, depending on who you ask. And this will vary from region to region and family to family tradition. For example, within the Darkod Mongolian tradition, the tree is referred to as the old shaman tree, or my old grandfather tree. And it's the tree that a shaman climbs up in trance in order to facilitate spirit travel. Climbing the branches of the tree takes you to the higher world, and traveling the roots of the tree brings you to the lower world. Um, but again, the mountain and the tree seems very interchangeable. And this even carries over into Germanic mythology, where we have attested in the story of St. Gallus, the Himmelberg, the heaven mountain, on which is said to dwell spirits and gods. Um, and Frau Holle as well, the folklore figure, dwells upon a heavenly mountain. And so do giants. Turst is a folklore analog for Woden, um, and he too famously dwells upon mountains. However, from the Germanic traditions, we also have various evidences of a world tree, which is especially hearkened on in various letters that bishops write back to the Catholic Church, where they're very frustrated by this tree worship that their allegedly now Christian subjects still engage in. There's also special burial rites with hollowed out tree logs, and folks being buried with acorns and walnuts. A clue on this possible connection we see is within Frisian coins. There's also the artwork that depicts giant trees, and of course in Northern German and Saxon traditions, we have the Donnereiche, or Donar's oak, as well as the Irminsul, the pillar of the mighty. And the Irminsul is oftentimes depicted as a tree. It has a very common interpretation, and that's actually what we're going to be touching on a little bit here. So let's go to the next one. All right. This is the popular design. This is the design that inspired the popular design of the Irminsul, but it was popularized by William Tell, who was an early supporter of folkish archaeology, believing in a supreme German society, Nazi politics and policy and art. And he was a vital inspiration for Himmler's campaign and all that kind of things. And yeah, so this is the image that he interpreted as the Irminsul. Now, this image here, a little bit of background, was interpreted by him as the felling of the Irminsul and the erection of a cross. And people, of course, have rallied against this. And for one, this depiction was probably not at all how the Germanic people envisioned the world tree. Its design seems to be far more Mediterranean, going back to early Israelite and also depictions of the tree of life in Sumerian and Akkadian art. This most famous rebuttal is presented by Bernard Mass. Bernard Mass was a contemporary, and he wrote that many of his contemporaries make the statement that the Irminsul is in fact not, that this thing in here is in fact not the Irminsul, but an artistically rendered chair. So now, while I do agree that this was probably not the Germanic depiction of the Irminsul, I also don't agree with the claim that this was a very fancy chair. For one, the structure itself doesn't resemble a chair at all. There's no evidence for this claim. No one has ever published any formal denouncements or detailed accounts of this being a chair. All we have is Mester saying that his contemporaries think that this is a chair. This is the common stance that you'll oftentimes hear from Germanic neo-pagans or reconstructionists. And while I agree that is a very good anti-Nazi sentiment, I do think that it may be a bit of a knee-jerk reaction, and I have to disagree because there's nothing cluing us in on this being a chair. There's no one sitting on it. Bernard Mass makes the claim that while the figure above is sometimes seen as standing on the chair, it's way more hovering above it. And so when you look at the artistic history, Kuno, if you can go to the next slide, even within the wider Germanic tradition, there's no imagery of this resembling in any way, shape, or form a chair. We have no examples of other chairs like this. There is, however, a Germanic tradition of this resembling a tree. But I want to say that this tradition arises out of medieval art. It doesn't look like my picture of the Longobardic art copied over when I sent you that, Kuno. But there is an image, and I'll post it later on, of a Longobardic carving in a column in a Longobardic church that shows trees just like this one, but used in a purely decorative fashion. Um, and so they had already converted to Christianity for hundreds of years at this time. And we see that this is a tree in an inherited artistic tradition brought up by the expanse of Christianity and the diffusion of a Roman culture. So the tree oftentimes is accompanied with mythological figures, that half serpent, half jaguar creature that is also really, really common in the Mediterranean image. So that's how we kind of get that connection as well. The motif itself is probably Mesopotamian in origin. Um, so there's no reason to assume that it depicts the Irminsul. Instead, it is just a tree. The original carving that we have, we don't know the context for it. All we see is a tree going down and a cross going up. And while it was tempting and very, very political for the bad people of the time to try and make this about the felling of the Irminsul, we really don't have any reason or substantive evidence. Furthermore, we do have depictions of the Irminsul. If you see over on the other side right there. So the first one I want to talk about is the one right after the two examples of the unsavory people. It's going to be a rock carving. And this is actually held in the church that purportedly has an Irminsul. They have a large marble column that was dug up when the church was made, and it's erected and still stands to this day in the church, with the claim that this was an Irminsul that was felled. And if you see right there, the crop that I've shown is of a pagan priest. Now, a little bit funny, the pagan priest is holding an ankh, which is a famously Kemetic symbol. But again, to an early Christian priest, all paganisms must have seemed similar or at least equally heretical. Christianity demonstrated a common tendency to blend together and group all paganisms together. This is demonstrated in accounts of the Middle Ages. All pagan cults were labeled as cults of Diana, despite the fact that they were regional variances and entirely different cultural origins that would have in no way resulted in one uniform single cult of Diana, the goddess of the pagans, like priests of the time like to write about. It was probably a combination of the persecution of these cults as well as the banding together of the surviving elements that may have established hybrid cults that the clergy then simplified as cults of Diana. But yeah, right next to the priest with the ankh, we see to the left a solar system, a solar symbol, a wheel, and we also see a depiction of an Irminsul. And this carving bears a very striking resemblance to the fleur-de-lis, a heraldic image that stretches way, way, way back to beyond Sumeria. It is, again, one of those motifs that we seem to find in most cultures, but it gets popularized later on by the Franks and the Merovingians, and then, of course, much later, the Carolingians, all of whom were Germanic peoples. So it could be that this motif was carried with them, though its true origin forgotten. We do also see, though, however, that the image of this tree, the fleur-de-lis looking one, is common on the Galehus horns. The Galehus horns were golden horns that were created somewhere around the 3rd century. They were found in Denmark. And while they are Germanic in origin, there's tons of Gaulish influence to be observed in them. So at the top picture, we see the Galehus horns. Of the Galehus horn, we see there is a whorl tree whose roots are being attacked by a snake-like being. This brings to mind a similar creature named Nidhogr of the Scandinavian mythology who gnaws on the roots of the whorl tree. And yeah, so let's recap real quick before we go any further. So the top left one, that's not a chair, it's a tree. But there's no proof of it being the Irminsul. It is a Nazi image. It is popularized and used and pushed by Nazis. Um, so it's a lost cause. It's nothing worth reclaiming there, in my opinion. Now, the one right next to it, the carving, and again, the copy of that same image drawn in a manuscript, probably a world tree, maybe the Irminsul. Um, while I think we can be rest assured that the carvings and these things depict a Germanic visual history, again, the chair or the Irminsul seems to be unrelated, though a similar design. Um, Now, what I do like is that we can all have a safe chuckle at the irony that the Nazis who cling to this Irminsul so dearly are in fact worshiping a representation of a Semitic tree of life, um, and have come to envision the Irminsul as this image, mostly due to a very nationalistic and romantic tendency. Yeah, there's absolutely, I'll reemphasize again, no reason to mourn this symbol, especially because the original symbol was probably something closer to the fleur-de-lis. Um, so I want you to draw your focus to the bottom right image. And Kuno, if you can give me the next slide, please. Can you go one forward? I may have put them out of order. Sorry. Okay, yeah. So here again, it's the same place, the bottom right, and I had it originally circled, so it might be a little tricky to see, but I want you to draw your attention towards the second band of images there. You see on either side that same fleur-de-lis world pillar or world tree, and in the middle, we have the world tree tied to a bull. In this case, the bull forms part of the crown of the world tree. The style of world tree makes a return in the second Galehus horn, where it is paired, unsurprisingly, with the bull. But this isn't even the only Gaulish influence on the horn. In fact, the same artifact depicts the earlier mentioned three-headed beings, as well as snake-limbed giants, the aguapeds, which were prominently featured on the Jupiter pillars, another visual representation of the world pillar found only within the easternmost provinces of Gaul, bordering on Germanic territory. If you could go back a slide, Kuno. There we go. These structures feature Karanos, the god of thunder, riding down one such snake-limbed creature. Could it be that these originally Gaulish designs would influence Germanic art and mythology and would be preserved for time to come? I think that this is very likely, since even up to Christianization, we have this image found within Germanic art. One slide forward, please. Oh, back one. Perfect. So in the bottom row, that center image, the gray one, this is an image of a bull-headed amulet with a third horn pillar design, which belonged to King Clovis, the Frankish king, who upon his defeat and the subjugation of his up-and-coming rivals, the Alemanni, converted to Christianity. Nevertheless, he was buried with this amulet as grave goods. And in fact, the Franks had more to do with Tarvos than just featuring a three-horned bull on some royal jewelry. Their very founding myth tells of one of their queens bearing a son that was likely sired by a five-horned aquatic bull. The three-horned bull, as we talked earlier, is oftentimes seen as a variation of the five-horned bull, because again, we have the three horns for the three worlds and the two for the ship. And so 3 and 2 versus 5 are just variations of the expression of the same theme. And in that way, the water bull could have easily, in the distant past, have been tied to Tarvos and the Gaulish imagery. We also have an image of the Indus Valley civilization, which you saw in the earlier slide. And it could be that the images over different cultures, they arrived at similar expressions thereof. Because even though there's a two-headed bull, the implication of the supporting of the cosmos is always there. Either way, it's clear we're presented here with a pan Bronze Age image of a bull supporting the cosmos in the shape of a pillar, mountain, tree, bird, or third horn. Um, in the middle there, you're going to see two Longobardic images in churches, which seem to combine the world tree and the horns motif by replacing the horns with two ravens or birds of prey, which are very similarly seen oftentimes on carvings and images of the Germanic god Woden, who has as horns two ravens. And so now we see even more blending of different themes, but still the birds resemble or call back to those initial horns. Seems to be an almost universal image during the Bronze Age, and Tarvos is, quite simply, in my opinion, the Gaulish expression of this theme, blended possibly with the equally universal hero cult theme, which seems to have gradually faded during Romanization and Hellenization, until, of course, the Gallo-Roman period, when it resurfaced as an expression of identity. Next slide, please. Cows in creation. So in mythology, the motif of the cow and the bull seem especially tied to creation and creation myths. So this could be our first possible clue. While they both play a role in creation, however, the roles seem to be different, but compatible rather than mutually exclusive. One doesn't mean that the other one can't be present. For cow motifs, we have in Norse mythology, Adomla, the primordial cow who licks free Ymir, the primordial giant. Of course, the customs of the Gaels, the Irish, they also have a primordial cow. I'm talking, of course, of Boann, the primordial cow mother, from whom poetically rivers and lands come. She's identified with the land. Boann also has a Gaulish counterpart, Damona, a common counterpart to Apollo Borvo or Apollo Mortisagius. And we can see there's a lot of cows in creation. Now, the cows seem to be givers of life and nourishers, while the bull, on the other hand, seems to play the role of a sacrifice, specifically the first sacrifice. The frost giant Ymir, as mentioned earlier, is the first being that comes from the ice that Abdomla licks free. And he serves as a sort of primordial sacrifice. He is sacrificed by his grandsons, and his body parts are used to make the world. Now, while this may not seem very bull-like, you'll see where I'm getting at this, because another example is the proposed reconstruction of the Mithras myth. Mithras, the Roman god of victory, light, and the sun, who was an import from Persia and the Zoroastrian Mitra, but he was nevertheless worshipped in a very Roman fashion. His iconography, his cult was very Roman. And this god's primary motif is him slaying a bull by plunging a dagger into its neck. The interpretations as to what this means have varied, but the general leading ideas is that Mithras slays this bull either to, one, create the world as Mithras Demiurgos, or two, to reclaim the world from Jupiter or Zeus and usher in a second golden age of Saturn, therefore recreating the world by the slaying of the bull. Either way, the bull's sacrifice motif is one of creation. Again, we see the sacrifice motif in the proposed reconstructed Indo-European creation myth, where two gods, Yimo and Manu, exist. Manu, man, sacrifices Yimo, twin, cognate with, again, Norse Ymir and the Buddhist Yama. And sometimes this is envisioned as a man, similar to how Ymir is anthropomorphized and sacrificed. And sometimes it's envisioned as the sacrifice of a bull, again, out of whom the world is made. And as we mentioned before in our last Comreton, for those of you who have not seen it, within the Helvetian poetic mythos, or at least the folklorification thereof, we do have a bull slaying a dragon, and through the mutual destruction, um, the bull then dies, giving way to life. Though this bull is oftentimes attributed to Tyrannos more than a primordial sacrifice, these two themes, as we'll discuss in a second, are also not mutually incompatible. Within Vedic mythology, there's also Prajapati, who in later Hindu tradition is envisioned as a trinity of creator gods, but originally in the Vedas is depicted as one being, which in turn sacrifices itself in order to create the world, and again is oftentimes in the Rig Veda referred to as the Great Bull. Um, in fact, this whole theme even extends into early Christian mythology and imagery, where Christ too is compared to a bull, and together with the crucifixion involves a strong sense of world tree and axis mundi created by a sacrifice. Something recognized by the Germanic peoples that encountered Christianity later on and produced such hybrid works as the Hellion and the Dream of the Rood, where the cross is explicitly likened to the world tree. We also have evidences of cow and bull themes combined, again, proving that one myth does not mean the absence of another. In the Mediterranean creation myth, we actually have Tiamat, who, although she's commonly envisioned and depicted as a dragon, is poetically also described as the ocean and a cow. Her horns are emphasized, her thick neck, her bellowing. So she too is a cow, as well as being the dragon. So again, we see that connection between the dragon and the cow, but more akin to a bull, she is slain. So the sacrifice of the bull, as we touched on earlier, we're going to be tying now to the pillar of the boatman. On the pillar of the boatman, we see, Kuno, give me the next slide, please. So these are sources, but on the left, you're going to see a different reconstruction of that pillar of the boatman. And we see here on the other side, oh, no, it got pushed off. Okay, on the other side of the pillar of the boatman is an image of Asus, the god with the axe. And it looks like he is felling or trimming the tree, which can be seen as maybe an order or maintainer of the world, or perhaps a primordial sacrifice. It could be that he slays the bull and the tree sprouts from it, or he's chopping down the tree, which is just a stand-in for the bull, since, as we see here in this image, the tree goes directly through the bull. Yeah, and of course, this is very, very common all over. It also goes back to the territory of the Taurini, who were a Gaulish tribe in northern Italy, that were descended from other Celtic peoples, not Gaulish people, but other Celtic peoples. I'm sorry to do this to you, Kuno, but if you could go back to one of the very first slides, one with all of the different artistic examples. Yeah, right there. So you're going to see there that the ancestors of the Taurini are responsible for the rock art in the Valley of the Wonderful. And we see here at the top explicitly bull images, three-horned bull images from the Bronze Age. And then below we see three-horned images, possibly of the bull, dating to early Iron Age. And again, within that same territory, we have shrines of and depictions of a deity with a sickle, which might be Asus, might emphasize that connection there. So yeah, we have a good basis for the slaying of the bull creating the world. Now, sadly, we don't have any direct mythic attestation of the bull who bears the world upon his back, but Caesar does mention a horned-like animal, which is revered like a deity, and it's very similar to Tarvos, and he mentions it in the Gallic Wars, where he describes the beast of the forest. It has the same name as the later Urishtir from Swiss mythology. I'm going to read this quote to you now. There is a third kind, consisting of those animals which are called uri. These are a little below the elephant in size, and of the appearance, color, and shape of a bull. Their strength and speed are extraordinary. They spare neither man nor wild beast, which they have espied. These Germans take much pain in pits and killing them. The young men harden themselves with this exercise and practice themselves in a kind of hunting. And those who have slain the greatest numbers of them, having produced the horns in public to serve as evidence, receive great praise. But even when taken as young, they cannot be rendered familiar to men and tamed. Their size, shape, and appearance of their horns differs much from the oxen. These they obviously seek after, and they bind the tips with silver and use as cups in their most sumptuous entertainments. First, I want to point out that Caesar's use of Germans, and I want to remind the audience that the Gaul-German distinction by Caesar was largely politically motivated for his claim to invade Gaul. Caesar draws the border of Gaul at the Rhine, when in fact, during the conquest of Rome, the other side of the Rhine was, at that point, as much Gaulish territory as it was Germanic, the biggest Germanic presences being invading forces such as that of Ariovistus. But we also see the tying of the bull's horns, which is alluded to in both the sacrifice to Tyrannos that we see mentioned by Pliny the Elder. So I'm going to read a quote about that real quick. They bring thither two white bulls, the horns of which are bound for them for the first times. Clad in white robes, the priest ascends the tree, cuts the mistletoe with a golden sickle, which is received by others in a white cloth. They then sacrifice the victims, offering up their prayers that God will render this gift of his auspiciousness to those who so he has granted it. Again, we see that connection with the sickle-wielding God and the sacrifice of the bull. While this isn't a direct attestation of the god by name, it does testify to the widespread belief in this Lord of the wilderness, or at least echoes thereof. We also have references to a three-horned bull in the Rig Veda, where the Vedic thunder god Indra is labeled the great buffalo, the great bull who supports the world, and this bull is also called three-horned. Within Scandinavian and Irish literature, we don't encounter the world bull exactly, but we do encounter stories that echo of the artistic motif. The story of the brown bull of Cullange. In the war between Cormac and Ulster, only the death of the white bull finally puts the war to rest and restores order to Ireland, remakes the world, recreates. Again, it's a very scant mention of this being. But probably a more poetic reflection of a vestige of the theme versus actual mythology is mentioned in the Eddas, wherein there's a farmer who has a cow. I forget its exact name in Old Norse, but in German it's Apfelgrau, which means old gray. And this bull has four horns, one on either side of the head, one in the center of the head pointing up, and one in the center of the head pointing down. And when the horn in the center of the head pointing down breaks, the bull is then sacrificed and killed. So again, we do have the sacrifice motif in here combined with the three horns, but everything else is a little bit disjointed. And within Irish mythology, there's a very thin allusion as well as Scandinavian, and these mentions seem to support a belief in Tarvos or an echo thereof and allude to his role. What Tarvos likely represented was a primordial creation myth, a great being slain to make the world, who now exists as the world or supports it on his head and back. Over time, this creation myth faded. It became less popular until a funny thing happened. Under Roman rule, it resurfaced as a cultural identity, similar to what happened with Latian era artwork. It faded away until the Gauls were now Romanized. This type of resurgence was common after the conquest of Gaul. Although the Gauls were Romanized, they still were Gauls, and they still embraced cultural imagery. This was a way for them to show pride in their own origins. Like, yes, they were Roman, but they were also still Gauls. So who slew Tarvos? This is sadly not given to us directly, nor do we have any evidence. This is lost to us, to history, and personal interactions with these deities by modern polytheists lead to varying different conclusions. It could have been a Mars-like figure, could have been Tyrannos, or a world maker like Sukelos, maybe a smithing god like Bobanos. Um, our most likely candidate, I think, is probably Asus. Um, and Asus may have been a god of his own, as he is described in Gallic War's commentary, or he may have been an epithet of another god. In any fashion, we don't know specifics. It could also be that Tyrannos has a role to play, with him being the pillar god. He may possibly be connected to the bull as well. The bull may be an aspect of Tyrannos in his role as the world column, or a supporter of order of the universe. Alternatively, it could have been both. The sacrifice of Tarvos may have given birth to Tyrannos. So I hope I've presented you with a couple of different mythic interpretations and something to go off of, a creation myth of our own, and the emphasizing of the interconnectedness of the ancient world. I know we're running out of time, so I'm going to keep it short. But any other images and stuff, I'm always free to chat about. So feel free to contact me or comment on this video, or directly message me. So yeah, thank you. I don't know if we're doing questions, if we have time for that, if we're running into the next presentation, but either way, thank you so much.